Introducing Mark Faris, an entrepreneur, investor, and leader who has successfully built and scaled 2 companies.
Welcome to the very first episode of the Mark Ferris Experience. I'm your host, Mark Ferris. But before we get into those interviews, I want to do something a little bit different on our first episode. I wanted to give you a peek behind the curtain and share a little bit about my backstory and some of the key lessons that I learned along the way. Welcome to the very first episode of the Mark Ferris Experience. I'm your host, Mark Ferris, and I'm super excited to have you with us as we kick off this incredible journey. This podcast is all about unlocking the secrets to building successful businesses and creating lasting wealth by learning from the best of the best. The top entrepreneurs that are out there, the business leaders that have actually done this, that are spread right across North America. Each episode, we'll sit down with the most amazing individuals out there, and we're going to deep dive on how they actually started their businesses, the key lessons they learned along the way, and to discuss some of the challenges that we all have to go through as business entrepreneurs in order for them to get to the top. Whether you're just starting out on the entrepreneurial journey or looking to take your success to the next level, you're in the right place. But before we get into those interviews, I want to do something a little bit different on our first episode. I wanted to give you a peek behind the curtain and share a little bit about my backstory and some of the key lessons that I learned along the way, starting from $10,000 in credit card debt. It's just reminiscing these memories, and building a real estate business where we sell $1 billion worth of real estate each and every year. And we also built a real estate investments firm where we've actually raised $50 million to date and purchased well over 500 rental apartments right across North America at the time of actually launching this podcast. And to help me do that, I've got my business partner, John Makarewicz, from our real estate investment firm, Ferris Capital. He's with us here today, and he's going to actually turn the table a little bit and interview me for a change. We're definitely going to have an amazing show. And really excited to have John on as my partner. He actually just had a big exit, $100 million exit, helping to build the largest real estate team in the U.S. And he's actually come on and partnered with us on Ferris Capital. And we will be actually interviewing John in the future to get his backstory as well. But John, really great to have you here today.
No, Mark, it's my pleasure. Excited to be here. It's a lot of fun being on, sort of the other side of the mic, so to speak. Some of our investors, that are close to Ferris Capital Partners may have seen some of my content, but I'm really excited to get the opportunity to interview you. I've known you for years. And, one of the things that, when we first met and sort of as we developed our relationship, sharing best practices and really kind of iron sharpens iron, that approach we have to business where we were masterminding there. I got to know your competitive spirit and your just refusal to really lose at the end of the day. But I think what's so interesting is your career from hockey, pro hockey player all the way to launching Ferris Capital Partners. It's really been quite a journey. And so, I think your listeners will be really interested to hear your story there. So looking forward to hearing that background from you. But tell me, walk us through that journey.
Well, definitely didn't start off thinking I was going to be a business owner in the real estate space at all. I actually grew up on a farm 45 minutes north of Toronto. I started playing ice hockey when I was 5 years old. I remember my dad would flood the barns, and there was actually a barn there that he flooded. And eventually he put up boards, and because we started, there was posts in the middle, and you run into them from time to time. So he actually put up boards around, and I had this dream of playing hockey in Europe. And I actually ended up doing that for a couple seasons. I played in Sweden for a couple years, and I had actually been recently married, and I signed a contract down in the Central Hockey League, which is a couple levels below the NHL. And I'd been there for 6 weeks, and the coach called me in one day, and he said, "Mark, we're cutting you from the team. Here are 2 plane tickets for you and your wife to head back today." And John, you can imagine how I felt in that moment, right? So he calls me and he says, and says all the best. And so I went back to the change room. I remember like it was yesterday, where all my teammates, they were getting ready for practice, and to just grab my equipment and leave as quickly as I could, right? But somebody had actually already packed my equipment for me, and it was actually, my equipment was in a garbage bag in my stall, and so I ended up picking that garbage bag up, throwing it over my shoulder, said bye to some of the guys, and head back to the apartment to tell my newlywed wife that we have to actually leave that day, like within a couple of hours, to fly back to not even to Toronto, but to Buffalo, because it was a cheaper flight back home. Wow. There. And so this was actually in 2006. So thankfully, Joanna's parents agreed to let us stay with them while we figured things out, right? And we didn't have a place to go. We didn't actually, our nest egg, we had just basically spent it on getting the apartment all set up down in Texas. But once we arrived just north of Toronto there, I was really trying to figure out what I was going to do next. And I was looking for another team, and unfortunately, I didn't have a big profile at that point. And a lot of the teams had selected their rosters for the year, and I was running out of choices. And I was working part-time. I was playing for the senior A hockey team at the time. And I remember I was hitting the boards awkward, and I actually separated my shoulder. So, this brought the situation to a whole new low, because I couldn't play hockey. I couldn't even go to work because I had a separated shoulder. I was just doing a construction job part-time at that point. So I was unemployed, laying at my parents-in-law on their couch, pretty much laid up, right? And that was probably one of the toughest times in my life. I was lost, felt stuck, and, it was kind of like I was in sinking sand at that point.
Yeah.
And, you could imagine how that was. And that was probably one of the toughest times. And, a lot of the listeners out there, they might be going through that tough time right now. And, you've basically done something your whole life. That's the way that you thought your life was going to go. And it was actually one evening, Joanna and I, we were talking back when all this was going on. So soon after the injury. And we had this conversation. I remember we were upstairs at her parents' house, and it was like it was yesterday. And she said to me, Mark, you don't have to keep playing hockey if you don't want it. And it was like the words removed this blindfold, and it totally opened up the whole world of possibility of what, I could do. And, I realized that I didn't have to play hockey anymore. And there was almost like a relief and excitement. And there's this new spark there that kind of opened up the door and gave me permission to say, yeah, you know what? Actually, real estate investing was something that I always wanted to do. And, the best way to do that I knew at that point was to become a real estate agent. And so, I decided in that moment, I'm like, yeah, I want to get into real estate. And so I signed up for the course the next day. 6 months later, received my real estate license, and officially I was a business owner right at that point. And I didn't even know. And a lot of the listeners out there, they get into business, and looking back, I was so green at that point. You don't know what you don't know. Mm-hmm. But thinking back around that time, there was a lot that I didn't know, and I didn't even have selling experience. That was the whole thing. I'm more of an inward John than mm-hmm. you probably noticed. You're naturally gifted with people. That's one of your gifts that you're more of an outward. And I know you've worked on your selling skills through the years as well, but it would come more natural. I'm more of I'll sit kind of, in quiet, and that's just kind of my space. So I had to get out and start to learn how to sell at that point. Basically, when I received my license, I'd say the key ingredient there that for myself at that point, I had this burning desire to want to be successful. So Joanna, and I'll give you the context. So the first 6 months we struggled, and basically we had maxed out our credit cards. And Joanna came home one day, and she was pregnant, by the way, at this point. So it was 2007. And she came home, she said, Mark, there wasn't enough money in the account to purchase milk. Oof. And so, Elon Musk, he gave this quote saying that starting a business is like staring into the abyss, chewing on glass. I completely understand, what he meant at that point. And, you've got to start, when you start a business, you have no guarantee of success. And that's one of the tough things, and why, a lot of people don't get into it. But there's a certain amount of hope that you do need to have. And that's one of the reasons why I'm starting the show, is to help entrepreneurs get through that early struggle phase. So let's just say around that time, I was really motivated, okay, to kind of summarize it up. And when she came home, it was like, the last thing that I wanted to do was to let Joanna down. And even more, John, than that, was to let her parents down, because they're a strong Polish family, right? I wanted to prove to her dad that I could be successful. And I was definitely not doing it at that moment. So there are two things looking back that I'd say were like super, like they were key decisions and key things that I gave at that point. Was that I was thinking after 6 months that maybe I should get a job. And so we ended up burning the ships and saying, we're going to keep going. And so I ended up like a part-time job. So we ended up staying focused on the mission of becoming successful there and having kind of that do or die mindset. I found that a consistent thing with business owners is you have to burn the ships. And that was one thing that I did at that point. So the other thing that I did is I signed up for this 9-week accountability course. Because again, as I mentioned, you don't know what you don't know. And so I basically signed up for this course and basically gave the last $500 that we had for this course. So again, burning the ships and having this mindset at that point. And that 9-week accountability course, I just did 100% of the things that they told me to do. So this course is like, basically go out and, here's what to say when you door knock. And so I didn't question anything. I just went after it. And so the other thing that I did was I picked up this book, Think and Grow Rich. And I know we've talked about this, book in the past on like goal setting. And so I wrote down my goals. I started going over my goals on a daily basis. It was actually, I set a goal for 40 sales, which is about 250,000 in income. And I just basically went hardcore on that all year. And picked up my head at the end of the year in 38 sales. I ended up coming 2 sales short. And around this time, Joanna was doing all the marketing. She was doing the staging, photography, and I was out drumming up business. So I was door knocking, and we had our first son. But we had maxed out our time. So we came to this crossroads of knowing that if we were going to continue to grow, and we wanted to do more sales in the 38 the following year, then we needed to hire someone. And so, like, I'm not sure with your first hire how that was for you, John, but like, it's a scary time for entrepreneurs when hiring their first hire. What do you like? Do you see that as well? And do you remember your that first hire?
Absolutely. I think, what I've observed is, high performers, it's actually something they have to watch out for, but, it's this, kind of idea that, only they can do it the right way. And so that's like a major breakthrough you have to go through, where you have to let go, right? Whether those are the less dollar productive tasks, which is ideally what you're delegating there. But even as you grow bigger, right, sometimes you're actually giving up those more important tasks. So I think it's one of those key lessons any entrepreneur needs to learn. And it's kind of what separates, sort of that entrepreneur from an operator as they grow their business, right? Because if you don't have that ability, but it is absolutely scary to make that first hire. And I would say, I know for me, and I know you've learned this lesson too, but it's one of the skill sets you really have to get good at as a senior leader. It's hiring, right? Really spending a lot of time on that and making sure you get it right. So anyway, 100% agree there. Yeah.
Well, and John, like that, from all the entrepreneurs out there, you're probably actually one of the best that I've ever seen on hiring talented people. So, we'll definitely have a future show, and we'll talk about some of the tactics that we do on Ferris Capital and in our businesses, and what John actually spearheads to be able to find talent. But going back to the story, it's scary. And so hiring somebody meant that we were going to be responsible paying a salary, even if we didn't make any money. And so it was this leap of faith. And you had mentioned that as well. Like, if you got to realize that when you're bringing somebody on, like, they may not do it as well as you, but you got to be willing to train them at that point. So we ended up taking that step forward. We hired somebody. We set a goal of 75 sales from 38 sales, and we actually hit it 3/4 of the way through the year. We reset it for 100, and John, believe it or not, we hit 100 bang on.
Yeah.
And so at that point, I was all in on two key lessons that I learned early on. One, goal setting works big time. Like, can you imagine setting for 75 hitting and then 100 hitting, 100 bang on? Even the previous year doing 38 sales when 40 was the goal. I mean, goal setting works. That was one. And the other one was when you hire great people, they're an investment, not a cost. We hired one person, we grew by like 2.5x. And so based on these two foundational truths, we ended up scaling up all of our sales. And so we went from 38 sales to 100 to 160 to 222 to 348 to 450, 565, 813 to 973. And then we started hitting this ceiling at that point. And a lot of businesses, they'll run into a point where they hit this ceiling. We couldn't crack through that 1,000 sale mark. And at that point, I was selling 150 homes a year with an assistant, leading the team selling 1,000 homes or almost 1,000. And I couldn't figure out why we weren't growing anymore. And when I reflected on it, I realized I didn't know the answer to two questions that I should know. One is, how do businesses break through ceilings? Like, why were we hitting a ceiling? And the second one was, what does a scorecard of a CEO actually look like? Or in other words, like, what are the key responsibilities and metrics that a CEO should be focusing on a day-to-day in order to create a healthy, thriving company? And, we scaled our business well past the 10 million in revenue. And I couldn't, really summarize what those key responsibilities were. So it became clear to me I really needed to transition from selling a home, because homes like 150 homes a year. You can imagine I didn't have a lot of extra time to think about these questions, right?
Right.
And so I transitioned out of selling, which was a big step, and hired a rock star head of sales. That led me down this pathway of studying all the greats, like, Jim Collins, good to great, Vern Harnish, scaling up. We got Gina Wickman, EOS Traction, Patrick Lencioni, just to name a few. I ended up learning and basically implementing. Like, that was one of the key things, that I implemented everything that I learned as quickly as I could. And then finally we ended up breaking through that 1,000 mark. We went from 1,013 to 1,444 to 1,700 sales. And we hit the 32 million in revenue point. We did 1.4 billion in sales. And the key lessons that I learned through that period was scaling companies really need to really master three things. There's the proper marketing function. So lead gen, lead conversion. You need to, and we've talked a lot about this, John, about building an inside sales team to be able to properly convert and to have a system for new leads coming in. And then the second one is the scalable infrastructure. So we transitioned to Salesforce as our platform. We built really strong processes and systems right throughout. And then the key item that I was missing in the past was that next level, A-level talent and developing leadership. That's the third one. And so we hired really strong frontline managers, strong senior leadership, and that's what really helped us get to the next level. And then the CEO scorecard was basically, it really boiled down to setting a strong vision, holding accountability to all of our team members on key metrics, culture, and cash, and then loving on the team members. That's something that the CEO always needs to be doing, understanding. So learning and making sure that you're always ahead of the game and what's coming down the pipe in the industry. And then you're bringing on the right team members and then developing strong leaders. If I was to summarize what a CEO should be doing, that's it at a high level. And we'll have future episodes where we'll dive into each one of those. And so through this period there, we actually amassed about a $40 million real estate portfolio. So we had single family rentals, we had office buildings we were buying, because John, that was one of the things that a lot of business owners that were more seasoned and retired, they said, I bought the building, and the building was actually more valuable than the business at the end. End. So I took that wisdom. We were buying our office buildings, and then we started buying smaller multifamily deals, 6, 10, 14 unit apartment buildings. And through the years, we had worked with thousands of investors, helping them build millions of dollars of their net worth buying real estate. And then, you probably remember, like in 2020, 2021, pricing went super high, interest rates went up, and some major challenges actually spun off of that, and for our investors and then for myself as well. So as prices went up, we found that in the market that I was in, Ontario, that it was harder and harder to find good cash flowing deals, meaning making more money in rent than expenses, where you'd have some money left over after you pay your property manager to actually stick in your pocket. And so Robert Kiyosaki wrote this book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. He talks a lot about this, the importance of buying investment properties that actually cash flow. And then over the last few years with increasing interest rates, I saw the wisdom in what Robert was talking about buying these cash flowing properties. So I started to see other investors in the marketplace that were getting hurt because, they overbought, interest rates went up, maybe they refinance, and just they had to start feeding the deal, as in taking income from the regular business and actually supporting this investment property that was no longer carrying, hoping that the prices were going to go up. And so it became more and more of a challenge that I saw for investors. And the other problem that I was running into as well, especially in Ontario, and I know there's a lot of blue states out there that have rent control. So they restrict the amount that you can raise rents. And so, John, I still have rental units where rents are $1,000 per unit below the same unit across the hallway. And I've shared this story with you where we've actually offered two tenants. We call them residents in our assets.
That's right.
Right beside our a unit that is actually, it's $1,000 less, and we've offered each of them $30,000 cash for keys to transition. And we had one resident actually come back to us and say, you know what, we're not going to leave for a dollar under $100,000.
Wow.
And so you offer 30, and they say, not for 100, 100 they'll do it, but not like 99. And so those were the two: properties not cash flowing, and then rent control. The risk profile increased to such a high point. And the other problem was it could take 12 to 18 months because the landlord tenant board was backed up. And so if a tenant stops paying, a resident stops paying, it could take 12 to 18 months to evict. And so, you can imagine if you're buying a cash flowing property and somebody stops paying for a few months, that can quickly wipe out the profit. And so for the entire year, right? So it increased the overall risk profile for our investors. So this forced me to find a solution for myself and for our investors. So I looked at Western Alberta because, you can find deals that cash flow there, but I saw how prices were affected by it being so reliant on oil. And so you want to be able to buy in an area that's very diverse in employment. So if one industry takes a hit, that real estate prices aren't going to be affected, and your residents are going to be losing their jobs and they can't pay their rent. So I still think you can make money out there, but job diversity is really important. And so you can imagine buying in an area like Detroit, for example, when automotive left. When automotive left, what happened to real estate prices? Well, you could actually buy a house for less money than a car at that point, right? And so you really want to buy in an area where there's new and growing employment. And so, John, we just looked at a new area in Atlanta, right? And we just found this new market that was kind of a hidden gem that is, growing and bursting, and you have new jobs and employment moving to the area, and you can actually see what's going to be coming down the pipe, right?
Yeah.
And so actually when I was in Florida, I started to dig into real estate. And so around this time of trying to find these real estate deals, I looked right across, North America. And in Florida, I found something that was really amazing. I found real estate that would actually cash flow from day one. I found out that Florida was actually, there was no rent control there, meaning that at the end of their 1 year lease, you could increase rent to market value. I also found out that you could evict a non-paying tenant in 1 to 2 months, where it took 12 to 18 months in, say, Ontario. And so their investment risk profile drastically decreased for investors that were buying. And I also found out that the larger 100-unit plus apartment deals were much more lucrative than the single family properties because of economies of scale, right? So, for example, you could pay less for property management, any sort of renovations. If you're renovating 100 units, you're actually going to get it at a better cost, maintenance. There's just overall, you have much more negotiating power. So it became crystal clear to me that investors needed to get across and access the border and actually get access to these types of deals in the real estate market. And so, John, the reality is that investors, and I found this, they were just super busy in their businesses. They were making, 500,000 or, say $500 an hour, $1,000 an hour, and they didn't have time to actually go find these types of deals across border and even, outside of state. And so I had this vision to take all the lessons that we learned from building our real estate sales business and build one very strong investment vehicle with the top talent in the industry. And our investors, whether they're in Canada or the US, could get access to 20% annual returns with 5 to 7% annual cash flow. And so this is going to help them actually get financial freedom faster. They could buy back all their time, location freedom if they're making, better dollars, and they can actually retire faster. And they're actually diversifying into the US dollars and doing it in a very tax efficient structure, whether they're American or Canadian. And, this way you can actually, if you go after the larger assets, you can actually compete with the larger institutions. And so along the way there as well, John, that's where we ended up meeting. And so this is kind of the Ferris Capital. This is where it was really born around that idea. And so, and then, we had connected because we had been masterminding, and I cast this vision to you, and you're like, maybe share your thoughts at that point when I'd shared that.
Yeah, it was really interesting timing. I just left my prior company and hadn't really thought too much, oddly enough, about what was going to be next. I had a pretty healthy runway before I needed to kind of find that next opportunity. And you and I had developed this really great relationship over the years. And so when you brought the opportunity to me, it was an easy thing to consider because I knew that you shared very similar thoughts and approaches to how you conduct business. I think from a moral and ethical standpoint, we were really locked in. What's important to us, our values, even beyond work. And so you brought it to me. It was fascinating because around that time, I was actually looking for some places to place some of my capital. And, I was kind of finding out more about these types of opportunities, these multifamily apartment syndication deals. And so, it was a pretty quick decision. You'll remember we went to a conference together so we can kind of, number one, spend some time and workshop. And we went to dinner and talked a lot about what, you had in terms of a vision and how I thought I could fit in. But going to that conference and seeing these other operators, it was interesting because it was somewhat eye-opening from the standpoint that I think how you and I found success in residential real estate was very similar. It was that structure and those systems we put in place, taking care of the marketing and all the inbound lead generation so our agents could really focus, and this is the key factor, that agents are focused on the client experience and that customer service, right? Because they're not worrying about where their next piece of business is coming from since the company takes care of that. And our business both had that same model. And so kind of thinking about, wow, we can do that in this business. You can really do it in any business, right? Excellence and that ability to execute. And you and I've talked a lot about it, but to me, it's often that 5 or 10% more. You don't have to do these grand gestures to achieve better client experience. It's often the small things done well and done right and done every time. And so when we're at this conference, it's not to speak, disparagingly of anybody that was there, but I just saw there's an opportunity to treat these residents with dignity and respect. At the end of the day, we are asking for more in rent. So giving value before asking for it. And so when we were having those conversations at dinner and that alignment was there, it was a really easy decision. And so I share with my wife, Megan, I'm like, gosh, it feels kind of weird to not really even go out into the marketplace and look for another job, but it just feels so right and natural. And of course, she had heard a lot about you over the years and knew that it was a good fit, for all those aforementioned reasons. So I love this business. It really is cool now that we have, 500 units, sort of under management, to see what we thought we could do in action. And for example, we look at our Largo deal, the amount of feedback we get from our residents, and they're specifically calling out the property management team and the work we're doing. And so it just feels good to not only provide great returns for our investors, which is really the goal here, of course, but doing it in a way we're also adding value to the residents and providing that better living experience. So I'm all in and I'm excited for the future and our partnership.
Yeah, for sure. And for those of you that are listening, John is probably one of the strongest integrators. If you read EOS or Traction, generally there's a visionary that's more like creative and casting vision. That's more my strength, and John's strength is basically in like very strong operations. So John and I, we really complemented each other well, even though we came from the same background in real estate. We do very different things within the organization, and we rely on each other. And there was a huge amount of trust because we had been masterminding for basically 4 years and sharing ideas. And so I want to encourage you, if you are in any industry, masterminding, you never know where those relationships lead to. In this case, we actually, we went into business together. And so to date, we've raised $50 million, deployed into well over 500 rental units, as John said, and we have 10 full-time team members. So John, just super high level, the team, what does the team actually look like today at the time of launch, which is September 2024? What does the team actually look like?
Yeah, so we're a lean, mean team of 10 people. So those lessons you shared there, it's always sort of fun now that this will be for me and for you our second sort of business, and so that opportunity to apply those lessons right out of the gate, right? So sometimes when you're an entrepreneur and you're starting your first business, I call it the stupid tax or the idiot tax. You pay that tax along the way because you don't always know, right? So you make the wrong decision, right? And so it's just a fact of life. And I think a couple of things. Number one, your willingness and ability to push through those failures or those mistakes and just keep persevering, that grittiness, that full out approach is critical. And so, not being, sort of having the opportunity to start knowing these key factors. And so I know for me, you mentioned something that's super important to me, and that's relationships. That's something I learned from my previous partner very early on. You never know what the future could bring. So treat everybody with empathy and kindness. That salesperson that's aggressively following up, they're just doing their job. And so there's no reason to be ugly. And there were examples where the follow-up was so strong over such a sustained period of time that we finally said, I got to take a meeting. And before you knew it, it led to our first television spend that really amped and leveled up our marketing and our ability to scale. So love that. That's number one. But this actually kind of similarly applies, but it's all about the people. You said this earlier, and it's such a critical, this is when you write down, that people are your best investment you can make in a business. And so if you find yourself at a point where you feel like you have a challenge or a problem in your business and you can't crack it or solve it, it means you're probably missing a person, right? And so at Ferris Capital Partners, right out of the gate, we said, okay, we're kind of new to this. We're both investors. We know real estate forwards and backwards. We know the markets we serve. So it's not like we're, you don't know what we're doing here. We absolutely do. But what we needed was, okay, we need to go find a very strong marketing person. So we went to the marketing place, found the best marketing person. That was your number one lesson in business, right? You got to get the marketing, lead generation, and conversion right. So we went out and did that. We immediately followed up by finding one of the best senior vice presidents of asset management, somebody with 20 plus years experience running these exact types of deals with a track record of success that speaks for itself. Going out and finding that senior VP of acquisitions, our strong director of finance with a CPA background. And now we're building out that inside sales team and that investor relations team. So being very thoughtful and very patient around that process of building out that team and finding those key players. And it's like that idea that like you and I can't do everything great. We can do a lot of things really well, but we got to go find the people that have those skills that maybe we don't have or are better, us use leverage, right? And allow these people to handle some of those tasks so we can be doing the next big thing or looking for that next deal or opportunity. So very proud of our team. Really excited about what this 10-person team is able to accomplish. It's almost like we're able to do the work of 30 people is how I feel about it.
Well, and I totally agree, John. And this is where I found like the talent that we've been able to put in each seat. I think that our background in business was obviously that helped attract the best talent that we were able to find out there. And so we've consolidated a really strong team. And we have this big goal within the company. We want to hit $1 billion in equity and acquire 10,000 units. To actually serve the residents, it's not even about the unit count. For us, we're very big on building a culture and experience for our residents that live in our apartments. And so we'll have a future show where we actually talk about some of the things that we're doing to be able to get $100, $200, $300 per month above our projected rents and how we're able to, really surpass our projections. And then, buying in these strong markets. So we like buying in states like Florida, South Carolina. We like Georgia as well. And so we really like that southeast side where there's no rent control, so strong landlord-friendly states that are cash flowing from day one, and there's huge employment and population growth in those markets as well. It's like you buy ahead of an emerging market that are actually, all tides rise and you get these higher returns. So we've learned a lot over the past 2 decades building businesses and investing in real estate. And we've met some incredibly gifted business minds out there along the way. And so, John, this show that we're actually going to be going over is really a combination of sharing the lessons learned from those conversations and sharing the lessons that I learned along the way, on scaling our own businesses. So both the real estate sales business and the real estate investment firm business as well. So there's going to be a lot of key insights and nuggets, and definitely, John, we'll make sure you're going to be coming back because, whenever you and I have a conversation, we just talk for hours on business. It just kind of flows out naturally. But, that's really what the show is going to be all about.
No, I love it. And, that was kind of going to be my next follow-up question. Like, why now? Why launch this podcast today, Mark?
Yeah. So for me, I found, and this is one of the strengths that I found with top performers, is that learning from the best is something that I did right from the beginning. I found the best people in the market, and I was able to learn from some incredible people along the way, and entrepreneurs, investors, business leaders, and their stories are super powerful. And I just wanted to be able to create a platform to share those stories. And I've always believed that success leaves clues, and this show is all about picking up on those clues and then passing them along to our listeners so that you can take those key ideas that are actually being done. It's not a textbook. Like, this is something that is actually tried, tested, and true from existing entrepreneurs that have been successful. All the entrepreneurs that I'm going to be interviewing, they've all been successful. So that's going to be something there that every single conversation that we have moving forward, there's going to be some sort of key nugget that the listeners are going to be able to take away with them.
I love that. For me, I think about, there's this sort of idea that not all readers are leaders, but all leaders are readers. And so we say reading, but that really is just that pursuit of lifelong sort of like education and continuous growth and improvement. So listening to podcasts, reading blogs, reading books, you mentioned probably 7 or 8 different authors just in this, 30 something minutes. And I think that is another factor that I think a lot about with those sort of like hyper successful entrepreneurs and maybe the ones that just kind of bump along and do okay. It's that really ability or willingness to spend that time to improve yourself, reading, learning from others. And you and I have talked a lot about this, right? But it's that idea. If I go to a 3-day conference and I get 1 or 2 really good ideas, it was worth the price of admission. You don't have to come out of this podcast with 75 ideas. It's like, what's one thing I can do this week and implement and add in? And so I think as we kind of launch this podcast, I know we've got a lot of interviews already in the can, so to speak. We're going to roll these out over the coming weeks. That ability to pick up on 1 or 2 of those key nuggets, I think is going to be something that's really going to help our listeners not only improve, their results, but their life, right? Because these lessons are applicable beyond business often, right? Who you surround yourself with is important at the workplace, but it's also important in your personal life, right? And so I think I'm really excited to share some of these key lessons with the listeners.
100%. The guests that we have lined up, we've already had a number of these conversations, and so these people have actually built multi-million-dollar businesses from the ground up. So there's a wide range of industries that we're going to be talking with, and we're going to be going over their journey, their challenges, their lessons that they've learned along the way. But more than that, we're going to be sharing some actionable insights on how our listeners can apply these lessons to be able to take their own businesses and investments to the next level.
Love it. Looking forward to it, Mark. I really appreciated hearing your story again. I've heard it before, but I think it's such a great example of grit, that full-out approach, that unwillingness to lose, and that pursuit of continuous improvement and excellence. So I know your listeners are going to be really excited to kind of go on this journey with us and with you. So looking forward to coming episodes.
Yeah, John, super appreciate you coming on the show today. And, thank you all for joining us on this first episode of the Mark Ferris Experience. If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to leave a review and share with somebody that you think needs a little bit of an extra push to go full out. Until next time, whatever you do, go full out.